April 18th, 1945. Greta Hoffman sits zip-tied in the back of an American transport truck. Cold rain drumming on canvas overhead. 12 other captured German women pressed against her ribs. 3 days without food. 3 days expecting a bullet. They told her Americans were monsters who'd torture prisoners before killing them. Instead, she's shoved into a Texas mess hall where a metal tray slides across the table. On it, a steak, still steaming, bigger than her fist. Mashed potatoes. Real butter. She hasn't seen meat in 8 months. Back in Hamburg, her mother boiled tree bark to survive. Beside her, Liesel laughs bitterly and whispers, "They're fattening us up before the execution." But Greta cuts a piece, tastes it. It's real. And in that moment, everything she was taught begins to crack. Because how do you hate an enemy who feeds you better than your own country ever did? Before we dive into this incredible true story, hit that subscribe button if you want more untold pieces of history that'll make you rethink everything. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. April 18th, 1945. Greta Hoffman had stopped shivering 2 hours ago, which meant her body was shutting down, or her mind had simply given up noticing. She sat in the back of an American transport truck with 12 other German women, their shoulders pressed together like sardines, hands zip-tied in front of them with plastic strips that bit into swollen wrists. Cold rain hammered the canvas overhead in a rhythm that sounded like machine gun fire, and every bump in the road sent them sliding across the metal floor. The truck smelled like diesel fuel, wet wool, and fear. 3 days since her field hospital outside Munich had been overrun. 3 days since American soldiers had appeared in the surgical tent where she'd been stitching a Wehrmacht corporal's leg, their rifles raised, their faces hard as stone. She'd raised her hands immediately, blood still on her fingers, and waited for the bullet. That's what they'd been told would happen. The propaganda posters had been clear. American soldiers were savage monsters who raped women and executed prisoners without trial. Greta had seen the drawings, crude illustrations of grinning demons in U.S. uniforms, their hands dripping blood. But the bullet hadn't come. Instead, zip ties. A search for weapons she didn't have. A march to a collection point where other captured medical staff stood in the mud, silent and terrified. Then this truck, rolling west for days, stopping only for bathroom breaks behind trees, where the women squatted in full view of guards who looked away. No food, no explanation, just movement towards something unknown. Beside her, Liesel Brandt let out a sharp laugh that sounded like breaking glass. Liesel was 19, a Luftwaffe signals auxiliary with a Berlin accent, and eyes that had seen too much. She'd been caught, trying to burn code books when the Americans arrived. Now, she whispered in Greta's ear, her breath sour from hunger. "At least when they shoot us, we won't have to walk anymore." Greta didn't answer. She was thinking about Klaus. Her younger brother had died 3 weeks ago in Berlin, killed not by Americans, but by Russian artillery as the Red Army closed in. She'd received the Red Cross notice 2 days before her capture. A single typed sentence that erased 17 years of birthday cakes and shared secrets and promises to meet after the war. Klaus was gone. Germany was gone. And Greta was alive in the back of an enemy truck, which felt like the cruelest joke of all. The truck lurched to a stop. Canvas flaps flew open. Daylight so bright it burned. American voices barking orders in English Greta barely understood. Hands pulled them out one by one, and Greta's legs nearly buckled when her boots hit pavement. Real pavement. Not bombed cobblestones or mud roads, but smooth black asphalt that stretched in both directions, under a sky so blue it looked fake. She blinked, stared. Through chain-link fencing she saw green grass, intact buildings with glass windows and fresh paint, trees with all their branches, no craters, no ruins, no smoke rising from collapsed apartments. The world here hadn't burned. It looked like the Germany she remembered from before the war, from childhood summers when her father took the family to the countryside and everything was whole. A guard, tall, sun-weathered, with sergeant stripes on his sleeve, gestured them forward. His face was unreadable. Greta shuffled into line with the others, her hands still bound, her stomach a hollow cave. When had she last eaten? 2 days ago? 3? There'd been half a potato at the collection point, shared among 5 women. Before that, nothing but water, and the kind of hunger that made you dream about bread. They were herded through gates, past signs in English Greta couldn't read, into a low building that smelled like soap and cooked food. The scent hit her so hard she stumbled. Real food. Meat. Her mouth watered involuntarily, a Pavlovian response she couldn't control. Liesel grabbed her elbow to steady her, and they moved together into what looked like a military mess hall. Long tables. Fluorescent lights. American soldiers leaning against walls, watching with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. The German women were directed to sit. Greta lowered herself onto a bench, her muscles screaming, and stared at the empty table in front of her. This was it. This was where it would happen. A last meal before execution, maybe? Or poison. The Nazis had done that to prisoners, hadn't they? Fed them one good meal to make the end easier to stomach. Then a tray slid across the table and stopped in front of her. Greta's brain refused to process what she was seeing. A steak. An actual steak, brown and crusted on the outside, pink in the middle, still steaming. Beside it, mashed potatoes. In a white mound, a pool of brown gravy, green beans that looked fresh, not canned. A thick slice of white bread, real butter in a small paper cup. A glass of milk so cold, condensation beaded on the outside. She stared. Around her, the other women were receiving identical trays. Some began to cry immediately, silent tears running down hollow cheeks. Others sat frozen, afraid to touch anything. Frau Weber, the oldest among them at 47, crossed herself and whispered a prayer in Latin. Liesel picked up her fork, examined it like a weapon, then looked at Greta. "They're fattening us up before the execution," she said, but her voice cracked. "That's what farmers do with livestock." Greta picked up her knife. The handle was cold. She cut into the steak. It offered resistance, then gave way, releasing juice onto the plate. She speared a small piece, lifted it to her mouth, chewed. The taste exploded across her tongue. Salt, fat, protein her body screamed for. It was real. It was actual meat, cooked medium rare, seasoned with something she couldn't name. She hadn't tasted beef in 8 months. In Hamburg, her mother had been boiling tree bark to make soup. In the field hospital, they'd rationed turnips and moldy bread. And here, in enemy hands, she was eating a steak bigger than her fist. Greta chewed slowly, swallowed, cut another piece. Her hands shook. Across the table, a young woman named Anna was sobbing into her potatoes. And beside her, another POW refused to eat at all, convinced the food was poisoned. But Greta kept cutting, kept chewing, kept swallowing, while everything she'd been taught about Americans crumbled like ash. That first night, Greta slept in a real bed for the first time in 6 months. The barracks were clean, not spotless, but clean enough that she could see the wooden floorboards and smell pine disinfectant instead of blood and gangrene. Each woman received 2 wool blankets, a thin pillow, and a metal footlocker for personal belongings they didn't have. The mattress was thin. The springs creaked. But when Greta lay down fully clothed, her body sank into something softer than the ground, softer than the surgical tables she'd slept under during bombardments, and exhaustion swallowed her whole before she could process what any of it meant. Morning came with a bell at 6. American voices shouting in English, women stumbling from their bunks, disoriented, waiting for the violence that didn't come. Instead, a nurse. An actual U.S. Army nurse with a red cross on her sleeve and a clipboard in her hands. She moved down the rows of beds, checking each woman for lice, tuberculosis, open wounds, malnutrition. When she reached Greta, she pressed a stethoscope to her chest, listened, made a note, and moved on without speaking. Her touch was clinical. Not kind exactly, but not cruel. Just professional. After the medical inspection came breakfast. More food than Greta had seen in a year. Oatmeal with brown sugar, toast with jam, weak coffee that tasted like heaven. The women ate in silence, waiting for the catch, the punishment. The moment when the Americans would reveal this was all an elaborate torture designed to break their spirits. But the moment didn't come. The guards just watched from the doorway, bored, drinking their own coffee. By the third day, the routine had solidified into something Greta's German brain could categorize, and therefore almost trust. Wake at 6, medical check, breakfast, work assignment at 8. The work was real. Laundry duty for Greta and 20 other POWs, washing American uniforms alongside civilian women from San Antonio who'd been hired for the same job. The civilians kept their distance at first, their faces tight with suspicion and grief. One woman wore a gold star pin on her collar, a mother who'd lost a son in combat. She didn't speak to the German women. She didn't have to. Her presence said everything. Sergeant Coleman ran the work details with the same weathered calm he seemed to bring to everything. He was 32, Greta guessed, though hard living had etched lines around his eyes that made him look older. He spoke minimal German, mostly commands. Work, stop, eat, rest. But he watched everything. When one of the younger POWs, a girl named Marta, collapsed from heat exhaustion on the 4th day, Coleman didn't hesitate. He called the medic immediately, made sure she got water and a shaded spot to recover, and refused to let her return to work until the medic signed off on her fitness. Greta watched this from across the laundry yard and felt something crack inside her chest. Not breaking, but shifting, like ice beginning to thaw. The rules were real. That's what confused her most. The Americans had rules, and they followed them. Geneva Convention standards, Coleman explained through a translator one afternoon when Frau Weber asked why they were being paid. 80 cents per day in-camp scrip, deposited into individual accounts the POWs could use at the canteen for soap, cigarettes, writing paper. It was absurd. Greta was a prisoner of war. Her country had just lost the most devastating conflict in human history, and the Americans were paying her to wash their socks. Male privileges came next. 1 letter per week, censored but allowed. Greta sat in the barracks on Sunday evening with a pencil and a single sheet of paper, trying to find words to explain the unexplainable to her mother. She couldn't mention the steak. It felt obscene, bragging about food when Hamburg was starving. She couldn't describe the safety. Her mother would think she'd gone mad. So she wrote the barest facts. I am alive. I am in Texas. I am treated according to international law. She signed it, folded it, handed it to Coleman for processing, and felt like a traitor for not suffering more. By the 2nd week, small mercies accumulated into something that felt dangerously close to normalcy. The Americans set up a volleyball court in the recreation yard. Someone produced a crate of German books for the barracks library, classics. Nothing political. But Greta found a worn copy of Goethe and wept over it like a reunion with an old friend. On Sundays, a chaplain came to lead Protestant services, and a Catholic priest arrived on alternating weeks. Greta wasn't particularly religious, but she went anyway, just to hear German hymns sung by voices that remembered home. Liesel remained skeptical of everything. She hoarded food in her footlocker, refused to write letters because they'll use them against us later, and kept a running commentary of dark predictions that never quite came true. But even Liesel softened slightly when Coleman approved their request to plant a small garden outside the barracks. It was a ridiculous idea. They'd be repatriated eventually, wouldn't be here long enough to see anything grow. But Coleman brought seeds from somewhere anyway. Tomatoes, herbs, a few pepper plants. Greta knelt in the dirt on a Saturday afternoon, her hands in Texas soil, and felt something she hadn't felt since before Klaus died. Not happiness exactly, not peace, but a small, stubborn insistence that life could continue, that growing things mattered, even when the world had ended. Liesel worked beside her, muttering about wasted effort, but her hands were gentle with the seedlings. Then came the screening. All POWs required to attend, no exceptions. They were herded into a warehouse where a projector had been set up, and an American officer explained through a translator that they would be shown footage from liberated concentration camps: Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. The images that followed were worse than anything Greta had seen in 3 years of field hospitals. Skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood, mass graves bulldozed open, survivors who looked like walking corpses, their eyes hollow, their skin stretched tight over bone. Around her, women began to shout, "Lies! American propaganda!" Some covered their faces, refusing to look. Others walked out, defiant. But Greta sat frozen, staring at the screen, remembering. Remembering whispers from soldiers rotating back from Poland. Remembering trains that left Munich, packed with people, and returned empty. Remembering Klaus mentioning, once, in a letter, something about camps in the East that nobody talked about. She made it outside before vomiting into the grass. Coleman found her there, bent double, shaking. He didn't say anything at first, just stood a few feet away, giving her space. When she finally straightened, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, she looked at him and said in halting English, "We did not know." Coleman's face was unreadable. "Some of you didn't," he said quietly. "Some of you did. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even kindness. It was just truth, spoken without cruelty, and somehow that made it worse." The letter from Hamburg arrived 3 weeks into Greta's captivity, forwarded through the Red Cross system that somehow still functioned despite half of Europe lying in ruins. The envelope was thin, the paper inside thinner, her mother's handwriting shaky from malnutrition or grief, or both. Greta sat on her bunk and read it twice before the words assembled into meaning. Hamburg was gone. Not damaged, gone. The firebombing had turned the city center into a moonscape of rubble and twisted metal. Her childhood home no longer existed. The postal office where her father had worked for 30 years was now a crater. Her mother was living in the basement of a Lutheran church with 40 other displaced families, eating British rations that amounted to 1,200 calories a day if the supply trucks made it through. Her father was missing. Last seen heading toward the docks during a raid in March, never returned. Presumed dead, though her mother wouldn't write those words, as if refusing to name it might keep the possibility of his survival alive. The last paragraph made Greta's throat close. "You are lucky to be where you are," her mother had written in careful script. "Stay safe. Eat what they give you. Come home when you can, but do not hurry back to this. There is nothing here but ghosts and hunger." Greta folded the letter with shaking hands and placed it in her footlocker beneath her spare undershirt. Then she lay on her bunk and cried as quietly as possible, because crying loudly felt like an insult to the women around her who'd lost just as much or more. Liesel, in the bunk above, said nothing, but her hand appeared over the side rail and rested there, not touching Greta, just present, until the tears stopped. Coleman had his own letter that week, though his brought different news. His wife, Mary, wrote from their farm outside San Antonio in her careful teacher's handwriting, the kind that showed she'd spent years correcting children's penmanship. She was pregnant, 4 months along, due in December. The doctor said everything looked healthy, and her mother had come to stay and help with the heavy work until James got home. She'd planted the victory garden by herself, tomatoes and beans and squash, and the cattle were fat on spring grass. She missed him. She loved him. She couldn't wait for him to meet their child. Coleman read the letter 3 times in his quarters, then sat staring at the wall for 20 minutes. He was going to be a father. The war in Europe had ended on May 7th, 3 weeks ago now, which meant his discharge papers would come through eventually. He'd go home to Texas, to Mary's smile, and morning coffee, and the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. He'd plant next season's crops and fix the fence on the south pasture, and teach his kid to ride horses and fish in the creek behind the house. And Greta Hoffman would go back to a city that didn't exist anymore, to dig through rubble for a father who was probably dead. He found himself watching her more after that. Not in any inappropriate way. Captain Shaw would have his stripes if he crossed that line, but with a kind of helpless awareness that wouldn't let go. She worked the laundry detail with methodical precision, never complaining, always the first to volunteer for the harder tasks, like hauling wet loads to the drying lines. She'd started teaching basic English to some of the younger POWs in the evenings, using a children's primer someone had donated to the camp library. Her German accent was thick, but her patience was infinite. She'd repeat phrases 10 times if necessary, never showing frustration, always encouraging. One afternoon, a package arrived for Coleman from Mary's mother. Homemade cookies, a new pair of socks, and a small bag of seeds, saved from last year's garden. Heirloom tomatoes, the note said, the kind his grandmother had grown. He stared at the seeds for a long moment, then walked to the POW barracks and found Greta kneeling by the small garden plot, pulling weeds from around pepper plants that had started to bud. He held out the seed packet without preamble. Greta looked up, squinting against the sun, confusion clear on her face. Coleman gestured toward the garden. "For this," he said in his broken German. "Tomaten. Sehr gut." Greta took the packet carefully, like it might dissolve in her hands. She read the label, in English, which she was slowly learning, and something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but softer than the grief mask she usually wore. She said thank you in English, the words careful and precise, and Coleman nodded once and walked away before the moment could become anything more complicated than what it was. One human giving seeds to another human who wanted to grow something. The garden became a shared project, though neither of them named it as such. Coleman would stop by during his rounds, ostensibly to check on the work details, and mention that the soil looked dry, or that pepper plants needed more space between rows. Greta would nod, make adjustments, and the next day the changes would be implemented. Liesel called it ridiculous. "We're prisoners, not farmers," but she helped anyway, because even cynicism had limits when you were kneeling in dirt that smelled like life instead of death. By mid-June, the tomato plants were 2 feet tall and covered in yellow flowers. The herbs had gone wild, basil and thyme spreading faster than anyone expected. One afternoon, Mrs. Patterson from the civilian laundry staff walked past the garden, stopped, came back. She stood looking at the plants for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she reached into her lunch bag and pulled out a packet of seeds. Zinnias. She handed them to Greta without speaking and walked away. Greta planted them that evening. Liesel helped dig the holes. They didn't talk about what it meant, that an American woman whose son had died at Normandy had just given flower seeds to German POWs. Some things were too fragile to examine too closely. You just planted them and hoped they'd grow. The following week, Coleman received news that made his stomach drop. His unit was being rotated home in phases, and his name was on the first list. Discharge processing would begin in 10 days. He'd be back in Texas before July. He should have been relieved. Instead, he felt like he was abandoning something unfinished. The repatriation list appeared on a Thursday morning in late June, posted on the barracks bulletin board, where mail call announcements usually hung. 200 names typed in alphabetical order, divided into 3 transport groups. Hoffman, Greta. Transport Group A. Departure date July 2nd. Destination Bremen Processing Center, then dispersal to home regions via available transportation. Greta stood in front of the list for 10 minutes, reading her name over and over, as if repetition might change what it said. Around her, women reacted in jagged, contradictory ways. Some cried with relief, finally going home, finally seeing family, finally ending this limbo. Others went pale and silent, knowing home meant ruins and starvation, and the chaos of a defeated nation under occupation. Liesel's name was on the list too, Transport Group A, right above Greta's. She read it once, laughed that bitter, broken sound that meant nothing was funny, and walked outside to smoke a cigarette she'd traded her breakfast toast for. But there was a second list. 4 names on plain paper, no transport group assigned. Held for further investigation pending denazification review. Frau Weber's name was 3rd on that list. The news spread through the barracks like poison. Frau Weber had run a field hospital near Munich, which was too close to Dachau for American investigators to ignore. Had she known? Had she treated SS guards? Had she turned away prisoners who needed medical care? The questions hung in the air unasked, because nobody wanted to know the answers. Frau Weber herself said nothing. She packed her footlocker in silence, was escorted to a different building by military police, and disappeared into whatever bureaucratic machinery determined guilt and innocence in the aftermath of atrocity. Panic rippled through the remaining POWs. If they could take Frau Weber, a nurse, a widow, someone who'd spent the war trying to save lives, then anyone could be accused. What if someone lied? What if service as a radio operator or medical assistant or supply clerk got twisted into collaboration? What if asking the wrong question or signing the wrong form 3 years ago now meant imprisonment or worse? Greta lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, her mind churning through every decision she'd made during the war. The soldiers she'd treated in her field hospital. Had any been SS? She didn't think so, but she couldn't be certain. She'd been focused on wounds, not insignia. And even if they had been, what was she supposed to do? Let them bleed out? Refuse care based on unit assignment? She'd taken an oath. She'd followed medical ethics. But would American investigators see it that way? Or would they see complicity in every bandage she'd wrapped? The interrogation summons came 2 days later. Not for charges, Captain Shaw assured her through the translator. Just routine background verification for all repatriating medical personnel. Standard procedure. But Greta's hands shook as she walked to the administration building, and her mouth went dry when she sat across from a U.S. Army lieutenant with a thick folder of papers and questions typed in German. Where had she served? What units had she treated? Had she ever worked in or near concentration camps? Had she witnessed war crimes? Had she been a party member? The questions came fast and clinical, and Greta answered each one with mechanical honesty. No, she'd never been near camps. No, she wasn't a party member. Women weren't allowed to join. Yes, she'd treated Wehrmacht soldiers exclusively, standard battlefield trauma. No, she'd never witnessed executions or atrocities. Yes, she swore this was true. The lieutenant made notes, asked follow-up questions, cross-referenced her answers against something in the folder she couldn't see. Finally, after 40 minutes that felt like 40 hours, he closed the folder and told her she was cleared for repatriation. No further investigation required. She could go. Greta stood on shaking legs, nodded, walked out. Made it to the latrine before her knees buckled, and she had to grip the sink to stay upright. She was going home. She wasn't being charged. But the fear didn't leave. It just shifted. Because home wasn't safe either. Home was rubble and hunger, and Soviet occupation zones spreading across eastern Germany like a stain. At least here she had food. At least here the rules made sense. That evening, she found Coleman near the equipment shed, checking inventory on work gloves before his shift ended. He looked tired, more than usual, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying weight that had no physical form. Greta approached slowly, her English still halting but improving. "Sergeant Coleman, I must say—" She struggled, frustrated, then switched to German and hoped he'd understand enough. "Thank you. For the rules. For making them real." Coleman looked at her for a long moment. His face was weathered and hard to read, but something in his eyes wasn't quite as guarded as usual. "You're going back," he said. Not a question. "Yes. Transport Group A, July 2nd. He nodded slowly, looked toward the garden where tomato plants were heavy with green fruit that wouldn't ripen for another 3 weeks. "It's not going to be easy, over there." "No," Greta agreed, "but I am alive. Because of Geneva rules. Because you followed them." Coleman's jaw tightened. "I just did my job." "Many men do not," Greta said quietly. "They do the job, but they do not see the person. You saw us, that is—" She searched for the English word, couldn't find it. "Das ist Gnade. Mercy." Coleman looked away, uncomfortable with the weight she was placing on simple decency. "Go home safe, Miss Hoffman. Take care of your mother." It wasn't much. It wasn't poetry. But it was more than most prisoners of war ever got from their captors. Genuine concern spoken without ceremony or propaganda. Greta nodded, turned to leave, then stopped. "Your baby," she said. "December, yes? I will pray for healthy birth. For peace in your home." Coleman's expression cracked just slightly. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was rougher than before. That night, Mrs. Patterson approached the garden while Greta and Liesel were watering the plants. She'd been avoiding them since giving the zinnia seeds, as if regretting the gesture. Now she stood at the edge of the plot, her face tight with something that looked like grief fighting itself. "My son," she said abruptly. "David. He was 19. Normandy." Greta straightened slowly, water can still in her hand. She didn't know what to say. There was no apology that meant anything, so she just said, "I am sorry." Mrs. Patterson's eyes were wet. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't forgive. I see you and I just can't." "I understand," Greta said simply. And she did. Some wounds were too deep. Some losses couldn't be reconciled with mercy, no matter how hard you tried. Mrs. Patterson nodded once, sharply, and walked away. She didn't come back to the garden. July 2nd, 1945. Dawn came too early and too bright. The Texas sun already hot at 6 in the morning when the transport trucks rolled into the compound. Greta packed her footlocker with hands that had forgotten how to be steady. 2 spare shirts, both American-issued. 1 pair of worn trousers. The letters from her mother, tied with string. The photograph of Klaus, creased from being carried in her pocket for 3 years. A small cloth bag containing seeds Coleman had given her last week. Tomatoes, peppers, basil, wrapped carefully so they wouldn't scatter. That was everything. 3 years of war reduced to items that fit in a box barely larger than a breadbasket. Around her, women moved through the barracks like ghosts, gathering belongings that felt increasingly meaningless the closer departure came. Liesel sat on her bunk smoking a cigarette down to nothing, staring at the wall. She'd received a letter yesterday from a neighbor in Berlin. Her mother was alive, working in a Soviet-run factory, living in a shared apartment with 6 other families. The address was in the Russian sector. Liesel would have to cross checkpoints, show papers, submit to interrogation by soldiers whose language she spoke, but whose mercy was not guaranteed. She hadn't said a word since reading the letter. She just smoked and stared and waited for the trucks. Breakfast was subdued. Oatmeal again, toast, weak coffee that Greta had learned to appreciate despite its watery bitterness. She ate mechanically, storing calories for a journey she couldn't predict. Beside her, a young woman named Anna pushed her food around, her plate untouched, her face gray with fear. Anna's hometown was in the Soviet zone. She'd heard stories about what happened to German women when the Red Army arrived. She'd rather stay here, in this camp, eating American food and washing American laundry, than face what waited on the other side of the Atlantic. But there was no choice. The trucks were waiting. The war was over. Prisoners went home. They loaded at 8 o'clock in groups of 30, climbing into the same canvas-covered transports that had brought them here 2 months ago. Greta found a spot near the back, her footlocker between her knees, and watched through the gap in the canvas as the camp receded. The barracks where she'd slept. The laundry yard where she'd learned that enemies could work side by side without killing each other. The small garden plot where tomatoes hung heavy and green, 3 weeks from ripe, that she would never taste. Coleman stood near the gate as the trucks rolled past, his posture military straight, his face carefully neutral. Greta caught his eye for just a second, enough to nod once in acknowledgement, gratitude, goodbye, and then the truck turned, and he disappeared from view. The drive to the port took 2 days with overnight stops at military way stations. Greta slept on the ground, wrapped in a blanket, staring at American stars that looked identical to German stars, but somehow felt different. At the port, they were processed through another series of checkpoints, their names checked against lists, their medical clearances verified, their repatriation papers stamped and filed. Then, they were herded onto a Liberty ship, one of the mass-produced cargo vessels the Americans had built by the thousands, its hold converted into temporary berthing for POW transport. The crossing took 9 days. The Atlantic was gray and cold and relentless, and Greta spent most of it below decks trying not to vomit from seasickness and claustrophobia. Around her, women prayed, wept, sang hymns in shaking voices, or sat in silent dread. Liesel played cards with 3 other POWs, betting nothing because they had nothing, just going through the motions of normalcy to keep madness at bay. On the 7th day, land appeared on the horizon, Germany, or what was left of it. The ship docked at Bremerhaven, which had been bombed so thoroughly that Greta barely recognized it as a city. Cranes twisted like broken bones. Buildings collapsed into themselves. Rubble piled along streets, where children with hollow eyes picked through debris, looking for anything salvageable. The processing center was a former warehouse, now run by British occupation forces with the efficiency of people who'd done this thousands of times before. The POWs were sorted by destination, given rail passes, handed food packets containing crackers and tinned meat, and pointed toward trains that barely functioned. Greta's pass said Hamburg. Expected travel time, 12 to 16 hours depending on track conditions, and switching delays. She stood on the platform with Liesel, who was headed to Berlin on a different train, and they looked at each other with the kind of understanding that didn't need words. "Don't die," Liesel said finally. "Don't get arrested," Greta replied. They embraced briefly, awkwardly, 2 women who'd survived something together and would now survive separately. And then Liesel's train arrived, and she was gone. Greta's train left 3 hours later. It was packed with displaced persons, refugees, former POWs, civilians trying to return to homes that might not exist anymore. She found standing room in a corridor, her footlocker wedged between her legs, and watched Germany slide past the window in shades of gray and brown. Bombed factories, cratered fields, villages reduced to chimneys and foundations. Everywhere, people walking, pushing carts, carrying bundles, moving through the ruins like ants, rebuilding after their hill had been kicked. Hamburg appeared through evening haze, and Greta's stomach clenched. The train station was partially collapsed, its glass roof shattered, platforms cracked and listing. She climbed down with her footlocker, stood on broken concrete, and stared at a city she didn't recognize. Whole neighborhoods were gone, just gone. Blocks of rubble stretching toward the horizon, punctuated occasionally by a surviving church spire or apartment building standing alone, like a broken tooth. She asked directions from a British soldier, got pointed toward the church district where refugee centers had been established, and started walking. Her footlocker grew heavier with each block. The July heat was oppressive, and the smell of Hamburg, dust, ash, sewage, decay, settled in her lungs like a physical weight. Children watched her pass with ancient eyes. Old men sat on piles of bricks, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes. Women in threadbare dresses queued outside a British ration station, their faces blank with exhaustion. It took 2 hours to find the Lutheran church her mother had mentioned in her letters. The building had survived mostly intact, though its windows were boarded and its bell tower listed slightly to the left. Greta descended steps to the basement entrance and pushed through a door into darkness that smelled like too many people living too close together.